Welcome to our last installment of the Policy Challenges During a Pandemic webinar series. I am delighted today that we have Christy Clark, former Premier of British Columbia. She's an advisor at Bennett Jones, one of the country's great law firms. And what I'm particularly happy about, she is the chair of the Max Bell School Advisory Board. And she is going to talk to us today about looking through the Retroscope. I think having a few words about politics and political leadership during a crisis. I'm just guessing that's what she might be talking about. So without further ado, Christy, let me thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for being the chair of our advisory board, and take it away.
Thank you. It's a real privilege, Chris, to join everybody to be the final speaker in this as well. I do think that the next section is going to be on the recovery is going to be really vitally important, because we do need, Chris, to think about, as you say, what kind of a recovery we want. And there's lots of talk about who's at the front of the line for what, who's going to benefit most from the recovery. And I would put a pitch in to hope people will ask questions about where will women be in that recovery, because women were the first ones to be laid off, and more than anyone else, and will be the last ones back, I think. So thank you. Thanks for having me. So the reason I called this the looking through the Retroscope is because I was listening to the radio and hearing the head of the Canadian Medical Association talk about Retroscope, which is what doctors do when they go back and they look at a case that didn't go as well as they would have liked. And of course, the fact is about human nature is we almost only go back and look at things that went wrong. We never go back and look at all the things that we went wrong that ended up with an outcome that we liked. And then they say, okay, what happened? What worked, what didn't? So for example, a patient who comes in, an elderly patient comes in confused, disoriented, diagnosed with geriatric depression or dementia, and then it's later discovered that they had a brain tumor. Brain tumors are sometimes very hard to find. They're hard to diagnose, easy to mistake for something else. And what doctors do when they go through that, of course, is they improve their practice as they go along. They share that information with other medical professionals, and that improves, presumably, everybody's practice. And I really feel like we have a chance to put this in the last few months through the Retroscope now. And I think it's really vitally important that we do it, because we don't have a lot of time for this learning. We are going to be facing, most experts would say, another wave in the fall, and that wave is going to be bigger. Some predict it, but it's certainly going to come back. So what do we do in the meantime to make sure that we don't make some of the same mistakes that we did last time? And so, I think especially for people who are living in Quebec, the failures are going to be pretty obvious. I mean, the one that will strike most people, I think, as most tragic is the issue of people in long-term care and residential care who've died as a result of COVID. And we'll be asking ourselves, well, how did that happen? And I think we also need to ask ourselves, though, not just how it happened. I think we need to think about why it happened. And the reason I say that is because, and maybe it's my bias as a former politician, but I think that I know hindsight is 2020, and I know how easy it is to become an armchair quarterback. And I think we need to, rather than be critical, we need to be constructive and be willing to talk about what went wrong and how we could do it better, knowing that this was a crisis that we've never faced before. But one that we could have expected, I think, and we could talk about that a little bit later. So if you're interested in making public policy, I think it's important to understand first some of the features of our decision-making system that made this hard to see. I mean, the SARS report came out in 2003. If any of you have read it, it is very comprehensive. I would argue it's prophetic when you go back and look at it. Specifically to Canada. Almost none of it was done. Almost none of it was accomplished. And so what is it about the system that many of you want to, or will, we hope, be working in, make a difference for that? And I should just say, before I get into all that, you guys and women who are in this first year of the Maxwell School of Public Policy, who are living through this, are going to be better positioned, I think, to find your way into a workforce that is transformed than just about anybody, given this will be a product of your direct experience, and you're combining that with kind of real-time education about leadership and it's in the course of all this. So good luck to you. I think you're part of a lucky cohort of a generation that may not turn out to be as lucky as we all thought that they would be. So I think first we need to think about when you're thinking about public policy, it's really important to differentiate between the short term, the medium term, and the long term, and to structure all of your thinking around that, knowing that planning for all of those different periods should be happening at the same time to some extent. It'll ramp up as you know, the more urgent ramps up, and obviously they don't all happen to the same degree at the same time. They all happen at the same time. And when I say short term, I really do mean, as I said, 4 months. That is our short term planning horizon. And I do see politicians look tired, bureaucrats look tired, our thought leaders are looking, everybody's looking exhausted. And I really worry that some people may think it's time to take their feet off the gas, and we really can't do that, because this is going to be harder to manage in the next term. And when we think about fighting a pandemic, I think of this as a war. We have, we're inside our fortifications. The enemy came, they found a bunch of gaps in our fortifications. They did a lot of damage to countries around the world, including ours, especially to elderly folks. And then they've moved out again. They are preparing for a second attack. So what do? We shore up our defenses. We learn where the gaps are, and we try and fix those gaps. So 4 or 5 months to revise our strategies here. And unless we come up with that ultimate weapon to beat it, which will be a vaccine, which will pose its own planning issues, but good ones, we hope, we are going to have to figure out what we're going to do next. So the first thing is we need to figure out in the very short term how we are going to address the issues in seniors' homes. And I don't think the solution we're going to come up with is going to be perfect by any stretch. I think the problems in seniors' homes are far too deep and far reaching for us to be able to resolve everything and get it absolutely right. And frankly, the people who live in seniors' homes are some of the most vulnerable people on the health-wise of anyone in our society. So we can look to other countries, we can look to provinces across the country. Some have done a much better job than others. And we can identify those key improvements that help us get through the next wave. So I just want you to show you the number of deaths in long-term care homes. I mean, it's pretty shocking. The average in Canada is about 81, 82% across the board. But when you look at who is passing away, it is not just senior citizens. It is senior citizens who are held in long-term and residential care across the country. The second thing I would say in terms of our short-term planning is we need a better plan to deal with hospitals. In my province, and this is true in provinces across the country, we were talking about how we had 4,000 empty beds to prepare for COVID patients. And we cleared those beds by canceling surgeries for people for cancer and heart problems. And, in my view, a death is a death, whether it's from COVID or cancer. If it's a death that we could have prevented through hospitalization and professional care, it still counts. And so I think looking back, most policymakers will recognize the way we dealt with hospitals didn't work. I mean, not to mention the fact that in some provinces, people, elderly people were moved into old seniors care homes when they had COVID, and that's a whole separate issue. But I want to show you this chart, which is how many open beds there were in Ontario. And if you look at that, you see you see the number of beds that were open in, say, acute care, and the number
You
of...
can't see that yet.
You can't see it?
No. So you got to share your screen first.
Oh, no, did I? Okay, shoot. Okay, here we go.
There you go. Now click on
Now
it.
you can see it. You didn't see the other chart either, huh? There you go. Can you see that now?
No, now you got to double click on it though. Or
Oh, for heaven's sakes. Really? You can't see it?
no, we can see the set of files right now, but you click on it. We know this will work. We did it.
I can't figure this out, Chris. Oh, well, here's my, there we go. Oh, I see. I get it. How's that?
There it is. That's perfect.
There it is. So there you see the number of available beds in Ontario. This is just Ontario. That's a lot of available beds. And they are predicting a spike in cancer deaths by 20%, cancer deaths of 20% in the coming months, because people did not get care, not only because they didn't go into the beds, but also because they didn't feel like they could get care. So all of the other treatments that were available. So, you know, I think provinces are going to have to think about, all right, rather than closing down all surgeries in our province and all treatments, why don't we do this in a phased approach? We you know, have some hospitals available to treat COVID patients only, as one example, and then have some surgery hospitals still open. So you'd slow down the number of surgeries, but you wouldn't take them out of circulation altogether. And, you know, British Columbia is just one example. They're talking about a 2-year wait to get through just the surgeries that they postponed while they had 4,000 empty beds. Now, like I said, it's easy to be an armchair quarterback. So I'm not casting aspersions here at all, but I do think this is one of those areas where we really can do a better job when we look through the Retroscope. So the other thing to remember for the fall is we're going to have a lot more people with the flu, and so that's really going to it's really going to add to the number of people that are demanding hospital beds. So have a look at this, which is oh darn, I'm not great at this. There we are. Can you see that, Chris?
Yes, I can. That's
so
good.
Look at that. So look at that. Week 52, and then week 1 of the new year. I mean, you can see over the course of the flu season from last year, weeks 22 to 42, there's almost no flu. And we are going to have COVID taking up hospital space between now and then. When you start getting into the later weeks, we're also going to have huge numbers of people getting in with regular flu into our hospitals. And so I think it's going to be a very different situation for us. At the same time, though, it's going to remain unpredictable, which adds to the level of complication for our public policy officials. Other questions: how are we going to stock up on our PPE if we don't have it? Where are we going to get it at this stage? How are we going to stockpile enough supplies to do all the testing that we need to do? How are we going to make sure we have enough lab capacity across the country? How are we going to make sure that we can get the results of that quickly? That work needs to be done. What's the plan for contact tracing? How are we going to make sure that we can do contact tracing in a way that protects people's privacy? Because I'm not convinced that that's being adequately cared about, looked after right now. What about where are the armies of people going to come from for contact tracing solutions? What's the plan going to be for opening up safely? Employers right now are trying to figure out their own standards for letting employees back to work, and that isn't going to be, I don't think, adequate. What's the plan for stabilization of our economy continuing going forward? What about what are we going to do about what will probably be a record number of bankruptcies declared across Canada? I mean, those are just some of the short-term issues that we need to deal with in the next 4 months. So you can imagine the huge pressure on policymakers to try and get this done. And you can understand perhaps better why I'm worried that I'm starting to see, I think, you know, in policy shops across the country, more and more cooks in the kitchen, ministries trying to get their nose into it and figure out how they can become relevant. And I think we need to be cautious about that. And the last thing I would say on this sort of short-term point is, when we get back into some really serious crisis in the fall, policymakers need to talk differently about COVID. They have talked so far about it as though we are all equally at risk of catching it, infecting others. Those two things are true. But we're not all equally at risk of being hospitalized, getting seriously ill, or dying. And I think the way policymakers have talked about this has made it really difficult to normalize now. I mean, you see people rushing to the parks, getting together, ignoring all the advice. Part of it is, I think, people had no practice at how to social distance and be safe when they were low risk. And when really the question is, how do we sequester people who are vulnerable as much as possible, do a much better job of that? I mean, you saw the chart in terms of the number of people who've died and where they've died, and then get everybody else accustomed to a different kind of normal, because being locked down and not being able to leave your house is not a kind of normal that's sustainable. So when I say the medium term, I'm thinking about things like, and you'll be talking about in the webinars next week, how do we open up the economy? What are the policy tools that we're going to need to create new economic growth? What kind of economic growth do we want to try and spur? We're going to have to figure out where to find new money for healthcare, which is there's not a lot of money out there. And we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do about unemployment. I mean, those are some of the medium-term things that we need to think about. And then on terms of in the long-term planning departments of governments, we're going to need a study commissioned into long-term care. We really need to figure that out, and it doesn't lend itself to a short-term fix. We need to shore up our ability to create a supply of essential goods to deal with a pandemic. And we also need to think about our food supply. How do we create enough to be self-sufficient? How do we deal with the issue of temporary foreign workers, for example, who we rely on to produce and supply our food in Canada? That requires a serious public policy thing too. How do we collect data and rewrite and reform privacy legislation? I mean, privacy reviews can take 4 years now in Canada for one piece of legislation. That is way too long. And so if there's ever a good reason to reform our privacy legislation, I would argue that it's now. And we also need to figure out how we are going to deal with the debt and how we're going to pay that off, and what the process is going to be to protect our credit rating, and all of those other things that are so meaningful for another generation of Canadians. And last, how do we make sure that other levels of government are better coordinated? And you know, the SARS report that came out in 2003 had some really elegant solutions for that. And I really do recommend anybody who's interested in this to go and read it in its entirety. It's almost a prophetic piece of work from those folks. And one of the things they point out at the beginning is many of the recommendations that they make were made before. The Lac Tremblant group in 1993, the Creever Commission in 1998, the Romano Commission in 2002, the Kirby Commission also in 2002. They talked about the creation of a Canadian Agency for Public Health that would be independent of Health Canada, a national network of disease surveillance systems, a new program of funding public health, more screening techniques at airports, more labs, more research into disease, and more microbiologists and how we could train them. I mean, it's extensive, it's complete, and I would say to policymakers, I hope everybody has a copy of the old SARS report on their desk, because with the exception of consideration for folks in long-term care, most of the issues that we are facing today were discussed and researched, and I think some, proposed and lots of solutions proposed for them in that report. So I'll kind of leave it at that. But just to say, remember, the reason we have these problems is not because politicians and bureaucrats are stupid. we have these problems because the system of public policy is big and it's cumbersome, and it's necessary to be that way. That's what works for a lot of us. We live in a federal country, and that works as well. I think, in fact, I think that this pandemic has shown that the individuality of provinces and the unique solution allowed them to bring unique solutions, which meant we did get a better result in many provinces than we might have from a really strict national plan. But people hate to make mistakes. That's part of being human, and that's part of our bureaucracy. We always have to make decisions when we don't have the full amount of information, and different people have different levels of risk aversity. Bureaucracy is slow. There's a lot of people working on everything all the time. It has a primal urge to grow. We fight amongst ourselves. There's a terrible shortage of money. And I always remember what Daniel Gilbert said in an article I saw a long time ago in the LA Times. He said, if alien scientists were trying to design something to exterminate our race, they would know that the best offense is not to trigger any defense. And so they would never send in little green men in spaceships to take over. Instead, they would invent, I'm going to replace the word he used with pandemic, because a pandemic is a long-term threat. We don't see it coming, and therefore, as humans, we tend not to plan for it.